All right, in our second video, we are going to be talking about economic inequality within our country and then looking at this globally briefly. So what do we mean when we talk about economic inequality in a society? Simply put, what we're doing is if we take all of the money and stuff that people own in the US and we kind of baked it all into a big pie, we're saying what share of that pie, what share of that wealth or income uh, do different people get? The people on the top, the people in the middle, and the people on the bottom. Right? How does all the pie go to the people on the top? How much do the people on the bottom get? In sociology and economics, we typically make the distinction here between wealth and income. Income is the money coming in that we use to cover our expenses, to pay bills, to buy what we need. Um, Once we set aside that money, once we invest it in a stock, once we invest it in a house or a car, in something we own, then that becomes part of our wealth. So wealth is the stock of things that we own. Once we take that money out of our bank account and put it into savings, it becomes part of our wealth. And we'll look at how we define that. So this begs the question, how unequal is the US? Here we're thinking about what does it look like if we are completely equal? Well, if we divide society up into fifths, the top fifth would get 20% or 1/5 of all the income or wealth. Here we're looking at wealth. The second fifth would get another fifth of the wealth. And we're dividing the pie up pretty equally. When asked about what kind of inequality we had in the US, 43% of people chose the most equal option. 47% chose the option on the left, which shows economic inequality in Sweden, in which the top fifth of society gets about 36% of the wealth. So that's 16% more, but it's actually kind of pretty equal. It's not as unequal as, well, look at the bottom, the US. As we see in the US, the top fifth of society owns more than 2/3 of all the wealth in society. They own 84% of all the wealth. Most importantly, look at the bottom 2/5. You can't even see them. The US is the most unequal developed country in the world. So when we look at income inequality, the richest fifth take half of all of the income. So this is all of the money earned. So if we put all our paychecks into a pie, divided it up, the second richest, another 23%. So that's taking fair amount over their share. And notice that by the time we've got through these first 2/5 of society, the top 2/5, they've almost taken up 75% of the income. Now look at the bottom income here. The poorest quintile in society earns only about 3% of all the income. This inequality has been growing for the last 30 years. The top 95th percentile of earners and indeed the top 20% have seen their income go up much, much more than the bottom 10 and 20%. So income inequality is clearly growing. So we've talked about wealth a little bit, but let's think about it a bit more. Wealth is the stock of assets owned. This can include stocks, which is a share of a company. Companies are owned and divided up into little shares of their value, and any of us can technically go and buy them. Bonds, savings, retirement, if you have money invested in a home, a car, real estate you might own, and all kinds of financial stuff. These all are forms of wealth. We typically will split into two measures. One, which is your net worth, which is everything you own, minus the liabilities or the debts that you owe. And then we'll focus more in on net financial assets. This rules out home and auto equity, or how much you own in your home and your car. We do this because if any of us are going to actually earn wealth, it's mostly going to be in a home or a car. Most of us don't have big stock accounts, aren't big Wall Street bankers. If we do build wealth, and where most middle-class families have built wealth historically, is through home and auto. Notice the difference here. If we look at the richest fifth in terms of net worth, the top share in society is 68%, so that's still a ton of inequality. But when we look at financial assets, so this is stuff folks own in terms of finances and companies, 85% of all the wealth in society is controlled by just 1/5. And notice that the bottom 3/5 of society hardly own any. This problem is only growing. If we look at this trend, this is the top 0.1%, the top 1/10 of 1% of people in society currently own almost 25%, or a quarter of all the wealth in society, the top 0.1%. Notice, this is almost as bad as things were in 1929. I wonder if any of you can imagine or remember what happened historically in 1929. So looking at this graphically, here we're looking at income, and this is before federal taxes. We note this year that the top richest 400 families paid less in taxes than you and I did, than the poorest in society. And this is perhaps clearer than ever in that the president's recently released tax returns, or not released, sought out, show that he paid only $750 in income tax. Wealth inequality, this is even more clear. So what things we want to think about and we'll talk about in classes, how are people excluded from owning wealth? How are people kept out of owning shares of companies? Why are things so unequal in our society? Part of this has to do with certain mechanisms through things like homeownership, building wealth up over time. But we also want to think back to the class structure at the heart of our society, slavery, and later industrial exploitation. And so we're going to look at class structures and how this happens a bit more in our class period and in videos to come.